The interstellar station floated like a shining giant in the endless black of space, its walls of steel and glass glowing with the lights of thousands of species, moving inside a marketplace that never slept. Traders and travelers passed by, each other voices mixing in dozens of tongues, while the air carried the smell of strange foods, mixed with the hum of machinery and the heavy presence of commerce in its rawest form. This was not a place for peace, but for trade and ambition, and the power of wealth ruled every hall. Among the countless figures that walked through the wide corridors, one stood out, not for beauty or wealth, but for the fear that followed in his shadow. He was a rich merchant, his robes stitched with rare fabrics, his arms heavy with jewels, and his servants quick to move aside whenever he raised a hand. Others spoke of him with trembling voices. Some envied his fortune, but most despised the way he used it, for his dealings were not of fairness or kindness. He treated everything like a possession, and everyone like something to be owned. In the same way, he gathered artifacts from forgotten worlds. He had started to look at living beings as things that could be claimed, bought, and taken in this world of trade where voices fought to be heard. There was a girl moving silently among the crowds, her steps light, her eyes sharp, and yet her expression was not one of freedom, but of a soul searching desperately for a way out. She had caught the gaze of the merchant days ago, and ever since she felt chains tightening around her, even though no chains were yet on her arms. He had offered her a place beside him, not with affection, but with the cold certainty of someone who believed his wealth alone gave him the right to take her. His words were soft, but the threat beneath them was clear. He would have her, and once his will was spoken, very few had ever escaped. She tried to vanish in the moving sea of bodies, but each day his servants would find her with a message, a gesture, a look reminding her that he was near, and soon her strength to resist would be gone. She needed protection. She needed something the merchant could not buy, and though her people always bowed before riches, she had seen something different on this station, something in the quiet, stubborn faces of humans who worked here. They were still newcomers, not as advanced as many alien species, not as wealthy, and not as feared yet. They carried themselves with a strange fire, like they did not know how to surrender. She had once heard a trader whisper that humans were dangerous not because of weapons or wealth, but because they would rather die standing than live on their knees, and that thought stayed with her. So, as the noise of the market thundered around her, she pushed through the crowd, her heart racing, her breath short. She searched for one face she had seen before, a human who worked with cargo, unloading ships and repairing broken machines. He was not tall, not wrapped in wealth. No one moved aside for him, yet when she had seen him days ago, arguing with a supervisor, he had refused to bow his head. Even when threatened with losing his pay, he had looked at the alien towering over him with eyes steady and voice calm, and she remembered thinking this was someone who would not sell his soul for comfort. When she found him, he was kneeling beside a crate, his hands dark with grease as he worked to fix a damaged console, sparks lighting his face. For brief moments she stood watching, unsure if her choice was madness. After all, what could a single human do against a merchant with wealth, soldiers, and influence? But the fear of being trapped forever by the merchant burned hotter than her doubts. So she stepped forward, her voice trembling yet determined as she spoke, asking him if he would help her, if he would give her protection, if he would stand against the one she could not face alone. The human looked up at her with surprise, his hands pausing over the tools, his brow furrowing, as if weighing the risk and the meaning of her words. She could see in his eyes a hesitation, for he knew very well the merchant she spoke of. Every worker on the station knew him, and none dared to cross him. Yet in the eyes of the human, there was also something else, a flicker of thought that spoke of choice, not fear. He asked her why she came to him and not to her own people, and she answered with quiet pain, saying her people would sell her to the merchant for profit. But she believed humans valued something different. She believed they valued freedom. For a long breath, he said nothing, only stared at her as if trying to decide if this was a burden he could carry, the noise of the station Around them never slowed shouts and footsteps filling the air, yet in that moment, it was only the two of them, her voice. Fragile, her hope clinging to his silence, his hands still resting on broken metal, as if he could not yet let go and choose. Then he stood wiping the grease from his hands, his shoulders straight, his face still calm, but his eyes no longer uncertain. He told her softly that if she had chosen him, then he would not let her be taken, not while he could still stand. His words were simple, but they struck her like a shield forming between her and the shadow of the merchant, and for the first time in many days, she felt the grip of fear loosen. But in the distance at that very same time, the merchant was already asking where she had gone, and his servants were already moving like hunters through the corridors following her trail. Girl followed the human as he moved quickly through the narrow service corridors of the station. His steps sure and steady, though his eyes kept scanning the shadows as if he expected danger at every turn. The great merchant had power that stretched into every corner of the station, and the human knew it, yet his back did not bend, his shoulders carried no fear, and the girl felt a strange strength just by walking behind him. She had never placed her trust in anyone before, but now every breath she took depended on this choice, and the silence between them was heavy with meaning. They reached a small chamber hidden between storage bays. The walls were old and rusted, the air filled with the faint hum of forgotten machinery. It was not a place of comfort, but it was safe for the moment. The human closed the door behind them and turned his gaze on her, his voice low and steady. He told her to speak clearly, to tell him everything, so that he would understand why she was hunted. She swallowed the rising tide of fear and spoke of the merchant, his wealth, his cruel eyes, the way he saw her as a prize to be displayed and controlled. She told the human that refusal was never an option with such a man, that once he decided something, no law, no official, no plea could stop him. Human listened without interrupting, his arms crossed, his face thoughtful. He seemed calm, but she saw a storm building in his eyes, a quiet anger, not for her, but for the way someone would try to cage another soul. When she finished speaking, her voice trembling, he shook his head slowly and said that in his home, no person had the right to own another, no matter how rich or how powerful. He told her that if she wished to be free, then freedom was hers to claim, and he would stand with her even if the merchant sent 1,000 men. Her heart ached with relief at his words, yet fear still pulled at her, for she knew the reach of the merchant, and the human was only one. While they spoke outside the chamber, the search had already begun. The merchant's guards stalked through the crowded halls, their uniforms gleaming, their weapons ready. The crowd parted wherever they passed, for no one wanted to stand in their path. Every worker, every trader lowered their gaze, pretending not to see, for to interfere was to invite ruin. Their orders were simple: find the girl, bring her back, silence anyone who dared to shield her. Inside the small chamber, the girl asked the human if he understood what he was inviting, if he knew the danger that came with crossing the merchant. He looked at her with steady eyes and said he had lived with danger since the day he left his world. Humans were always told they were weaker in this galaxy, that they lacked the advanced weapons or vast wealth of other races, but he believed there were strengths that could not be measured in gold or machines. He told her that courage was a weapon too, and he would not turn away from her plea. She studied his face, and for the first time, she felt she was looking at someone who was not afraid to stand against the tide. The girl whispered that the merchant would find them soon, and asked how they could escape. The human thought for a moment, then began to move quickly. He pulled open crates and scavenged pieces of equipment, his hands working with skill. She watched as he built something small and strange, wires twisting, metal plates bending until it looked like a simple device. He told her it was a jammer that would blind the merchant's trackers for a short, while not long, but enough to give them distance. She marveled at the cleverness of humans, at the way they could shape broken things into tools of survival. Soon, the device hummed softly, filling the chamber with a faint vibration. The human motioned for her to follow, and they slipped into another corridor hidden from the main path. The station was a maze of passages, some wide and bright, others narrow and forgotten, and he seemed to know them all, guiding her with quick decisions, always keeping her away from the footsteps of the merchant's men. But the search was spreading faster than he expected. The merchant was pouring wealth into the hunt, promising rewards to informants and threats to the silent. Soon whispers began to move through the station, voices carrying news of the girl and the human hiding together. Some spoke in awe that a human dared to defy the merchant. Others shook their heads, certain that doom would fall on them both. The girl could feel the net tightening around them, yet her trust in the human grew with every step. His calm never wavered, his eyes sharp and focused. When she stumbled, he held her steady. When fear threatened to break her, he spoke quiet words, reminding her that as long as she walked beside him, she was not alone, and those words carried her through the endless corridors. At last they reached an old docking bay, one rarely used, its doors half broken, its lights flickering. The human told her they could not stay long here, for the merchant's men would soon sweep this sector. But it was a place to rest for a brief moment. She sat against a crate, her body trembling with exhaustion, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the hunt was far from over. The human crouched beside her, his face still calm, though his hands tightened on the small tool he carried as if preparing for the storming. That silence, she realized something that made her breath catch. She had chosen to trust him, not only because she feared the merchant, but because she saw in the human a spark that reminded her of something she had always longed for: the right to choose her own path. He was not rich, not powerful, not feared, but he was free, and in his freedom he carried a strength no merchant could buy. But far away in the shining halls of the station, the merchant had received word from his men that the girl was with a human, and his anger was like fire spreading quickly, his voice cold and sharp, as he ordered every guard, every spy, every loyal servant to hunt them down. He would not be denied, and he would not forgive defiance. The old docking bay was quiet, except for the faint hum of machines that had not been used for many seasons. The walls carried marks of rust and time, while the air smelled of oil and dust. The girl sat close to the crates, her heart pounding in her chest, every sound outside making her think. The merchant's men were already at the door, yet the human beside her did not show fear. His gaze was steady, his hands restless as he checked the small jammer again, making sure it still gave them a thin layer of cover, though both of them knew it would not last forever. She asked him why he would risk so much for someone he had only just met, her voice soft and uncertain, her eyes filled with doubt. The human looked at her for a long moment before answering. He said that sometimes a choice came not from how long you had known someone, but from what was right in the moment. He told her that he had seen her eyes, and they were not the eyes of someone seeking power or greed. They were the eyes of someone fighting for freedom, and he could not walk away from that. She felt his words settle inside her heart like a flame growing slowly, and she wondered why none of her own people had ever spoken like this. Outside the docking bay, the sound of boots echoed in the distant corridors. The merchant's men were closing, and their voices carried through the metal walls sharp orders, barked in a language filled with command and threat. The girl trembled, but the human placed a hand gently on her shoulder and told her to breathe, to hold steady. He said fear was a chain that would break them faster than any weapon, and if she could stand without letting fear rule her, then they had a chance. They moved again, slipping out of the bay and into a narrow tunnel that twisted through the underbelly of the station. The path was dark and the air heavy, but the human knew the way. His years of work had taken him through every hidden route, every maintenance shaft. He walked with confidence, guiding her with small gestures, always listening for footsteps behind them. They passed through places where few dared to go, abandoned rooms, broken machines, forgotten storerooms that smelled of metal and silence. Yet in each place, she felt his steady presence, like a shield that turned shadows into something less terrifying. As they walked, she began to speak more, her words hesitant but honest. She told him about her world, a place where wealth was everything, where families measured their worth in gold and gems, where children were raised not to dream, but to serve power. She confessed that she had always felt like a stranger, even among her own people, that she had looked at the stars and wondered if somewhere out there freedom meant more than money. He listened, quietly, never judging, never interrupting until she finished. And then he said that freedom was not given, it was taken with courage and with will. She saw in his face that he believed his words with all his heart, and it made her feel stronger. But their path was not unseen whispers, carried quickly through the station like smoke from a fire, the story of a human defying the rich merchant, spread from trader to trader, from worker to worker. Some whispered with admiration, some with disbelief, some with fear. The merchant's wrath was legendary, and to stand against him was madness. Yet the story grew, and with every step the human and the girl felt the weight of eyes unseen, some silent in their corners, some waiting to betray them for reward. At one point they stopped near a wide chamber filled with broken ships once used for training, now rusting in silence. The human led her into the hollow of a fallen craft, its walls offering shelter for a short time. He crouched by a gap in the metal, peering out at the corridors, while she sat close, her body weary, her voice trembling as she asked what he would do when the merchant found them, because she knew he would not stop until he had them both. The human turned and looked at her with calm certainty. He said that the merchant could chase them through every hall, could send 100 soldiers after them. But in the end, he was just a man who believed money was power, and money could not buy courage or loyalty or the will to stand when the storm came. She listened and felt her fear change into something sharper, a fragile hope that perhaps the merchant was not as untouchable as she once thought. But soon the sound of footsteps came again, louder, this time closer. The human motioned for her to stay silent. He guided her through a back opening of the ship and into another tunnel. The chase was relentless, their breaths quick, their bodies tense as they slipped into the crowd, once more blending with traders and travelers, though the merchant's guards were everywhere, scanning faces, questioning strangers. She held her breath each time their gaze passed close, but the human kept moving, always calm, always steady, until at last they slipped into a hidden stairwell that led deeper into the maintenance levels. There, in the silence of the stairwell, she felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, legs shaking, her strength fading. She whispered that maybe they could not escape, maybe it was impossible to stand against a man with such power. The human stopped and turned to her, his voice low but strong. He said that power only ruled those who allowed themselves to bow, that the merchant was strong only because others bent their heads. If they stood tall, even in the face of fear, then they were already freer than him. She looked at him and saw no doubt, no hesitation, only the fierce belief of someone who would rather fall fighting than live in chains. And for the first time she felt that maybe she could believe in herself too. But far above them, the merchant sat in a chamber filled with riches, his eyes cold as he studied the reports. His anger deep, his pride wounded. The idea that a human dared to defy him burned like fire in his chest. He swore that he would make an example of them both, not only to break them, but to remind every soul on the station that his will was law. He sent orders to close the exits, to flood the maintenance levels with his guards, to corner them like prey in a cage. And as the human and the girl rested in the shadowed stairwell, unaware of the trap closing around them, the echoes of boots already began to thunder on the levels above. The stairwell was dark, and the sound of their own breaths echoed against the metal walls. The girl leaned against the cold railing, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion, while the human stood silent, his ears sharp to every distant sound above them. The thundering of boots grew louder, like a storm rolling closer with each passing moment. He knew the merchant had spread his men across the station, cutting off exits, turning every corridor into a trap. Yet his face did not change, his calm eyes steady, his hands already working at a plan that seemed impossible. But he refused to let despair show. He led her further down into the belly of the station, where the air grew thick with dust and the lights flickered with weakness. These were the forgotten places of the great trade hub, places no wealthy merchant ever walked, because they held no profit, only silence and broken machines. The girl followed closer, fear still alive, but now it burned. Beside the spark of trust she carried for this human, who did not bend to power, they entered an old chamber once used for storage. Its walls scarred, its doors rusted. The human stopped here and told her they could not run forever. The merchant would not stop until one of them fell, and running only delayed the moment. He looked at her with firm eyes and said that now was the time to turn and face the storm. She felt her body tremble at his words, but deep within, she knew he was right. The chase could not last forever, and perhaps the only way to win freedom was to stand and claim. I've searched the chamber, his hands quick, his eyes sharp, gathering scraps of metal wires, old containers, turning them into traps and tools with the kind of skill that came only from years of working with broken things. She watched him bend ruined fragments into weapons of survival, his determination carving hope out of the dust. She felt her chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with awe, for he was only one man with no riches and no soldiers, yet he stood as if he carried the strength of an army. When the merchant's men reached the lower levels, their voices filled the corridors, their lights slicing through the shadows. The human finished his work and turned to her, telling her to stay hidden until the moment came. Her heart pounded, but she nodded, for she trusted him more than she trusted her own trembling hands. Then the door burst open, and the guards poured in, their eyes sharp, their weapons raised. The first trap lit the chamber with a flash as sparks exploded from the walls, blinding the soldiers for a moment. The human moved swiftly, striking with speed, using the shadows and the confusion. Every step measured, every strike calculated. The girl watched from her corner, her fear mixing with fierce hope as she saw him fight, not with the strength of wealth or weapons, but with wit and courage. The guards regrouped, pressing forward, their numbers greater, their armor strong, but the human did not falter. He used the broken chamber itself as a weapon, leading them into narrow passages where they could not stand together, turning their heavy armor into chains that slowed them down one by one. They fell not in death, but in humiliation, defeated by a man they had been told was weaker. Yet as the last guard stumbled, the air grew cold with a presence more terrible than the clash of weapons. The merchant himself entered the chamber, his robes shining, his eyes burning with anger, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. He looked at the human and the girl with fury, a storm of pride and wrath behind his calm words. He called the girl a possession, claimed that no human, no worker, no lesser creature could stand between him and what was his. The girl felt the weight of his words pressing on her soul, as if chains were wrapping around her again. But before she could fall into despair, the human stepped forward, his voice firm, his gaze steady. He told the merchant that no being could own another, that wealth and jewels were nothing compared to the will to be free. His words were simple, but they rang through the chamber louder than the merchant's threats. The guards, still rising from their defeat, watched in silence, uncertain for the first time. The merchant laughed, cruel and sharp, saying that courage was nothing before power, and with a gesture he called forth more men, filling the chamber with armored figures, their weapons raised. The girl felt her breath catch, but the human did not move. He stood tall, his voice rising again, telling the merchant that even if they both fell here today, the truth would not die, that the eyes of the station were upon them, and all would remember that a human had stood against greed and cruelty. The merchant's face twisted with fury, yet in that moment something shifted. The guards hesitated, their eyes flickering between the merchant and the human, doubt creeping into their loyalty. They had seen his men fall to simple tricks. They had seen the girl stand beside him unbroken. They had heard words that rang with a strength money could not buy, and for the first time they began to question. The girl felt courage surge in her chest. She stepped from her hiding place and raised her voice, declaring she would never belong to the merchant, that she chose her own path, that she chose freedom, and she chose to stand with the human. Her words, clear and sharp, carried across the chamber, and the silence that followed was heavier than any blade. The merchant roared with anger, his pride wounded beyond repair. He lunged forward as if to strike them down himself, his wealth, his power, his jewels, shining like armor around his body, but the human did not step back. He raised his head, his eyes unflinching, and faced the storm. The chamber shook with the weight of voices and footsteps as the merchant's fury filled the air, his jeweled hands raised like claws, his body heavy with the arrogance of a man who believed all things could be bought and all lives bent beneath him. Yet in the silence that followed the human's words there was a change, not loud, not sudden, but deep and powerful. The guards who stood ready to strike hesitated, their eyes no longer fixed on the human as prey, but as something more, their minds uncertain, their loyalty shaken. The merchant shouted commands, his voice sharp like thunder. He promised gold to those who seized the girl and punishment to those who failed. But hesitation had already spread like cracks in glass. The guards moved slower, their steps unsure. Some even stepped back, their hearts remembering how easily they had been outmatched in the shadows by this one human who refused to bow. And they saw too the girl standing with him, her voice steady, her eyes bright with a courage that wealth could not silence. Merchant lunged forward, his robes swirling, his hand reaching for the girl, as if to drag her down by force. But the human moved first, his body swift, his strike simple, yet filled with resolve. He caught the merchant's arm and twisted, forcing him to stumble. The crowd of soldiers gasped, for they had never seen their master falter. The jewels on his wrist clattered against the floor like broken pride. The fight was not of equals, for the merchant was stronger, richer, guarded by layers of armor hidden beneath his robes. Yet the human fought with the strength of desperation and the clarity of a man who knew this was not for glory, but for freedom. Each strike he made was not to kill, but to prove that power without honor was hollow. The girl watched, her heart pounding, each movement of the human burning into her memory. She saw the merchant growl in rage, his strikes wild, his pride cracking under the weight of resistance. Noise of the battle carried beyond the chamber, and more workers, more traders, more strangers gathered at the edges, their faces curious, their voices whispering. They saw the human facing the richest man of the station, and they saw him stand unbroken. Even when struck down to one knee, he rose again. Even when shoved back, he planted his feet again. His eyes never lowered, and his voice rose once more, declaring that freedom was the right of every living soul, and no wealth could steal it. The girl stepped beside him, her voice joining his. She cried out that she would never be property, that no jewel, no gold, no promise could buy her spirit. And her words rang across the chamber, louder than the clash of fists. The crowd stirred, whispers turning into shouts, voices echoing against the metal walls, some calling for justice, some for freedom, some simply repeating the words of the human as if they carried a power long forgotten. The merchant turned pale with rage as he realized the chamber no longer belonged to him. His last strike came fierce and desperate. But the human caught it and forced him down to the ground, his jewels scattering, his robe torn, his pride shattered. Silence fell heavy. Every eye fixed on the image of a man once untouchable, now humbled on the floor. The human did not strike again. He only stood above him, his breath heavy, his voice low, telling the merchant that power built on chains was nothing more than weakness wrapped in gold. Guards lowered their weapons, their loyalty broken, for they could no longer follow a master who had been defeated not by riches or armies, but by courage. They stepped as it end, let the human and the girl pass. The crowd parted for them, voices rising in awe and respect, no longer whispers, but open words spoken with strength. Some bowed their heads not in fear, but in honor. The station itself seemed to breathe a different air. The merchant lay broken among his riches, his eyes burning with hate, but his power shattered. For once seen defeated, he could never again command the same fear. His name once carried like a whip. The crowd had witnessed the truth, and truth could not be bought. The girl walked beside the human, her steps lighter, her heart free. For the first time she felt no chains on her soul, no shadow pressing against her. She looked at him and saw not just the man who had saved her, but the man who had shown her what it meant to choose. She told him softly that she was no longer afraid, and he smiled. Faintly, though his body was weary, his eyes still shone with that steady fire. As they left the chamber, the station stirred with change. Voices spread the tale of the human who stood against the merchant. The story traveled faster than any order, faster than any bribe. It grew into something larger than both of them. It became a seed planted in the hearts of those who had long bowed their heads, a reminder that wealth was not the only power in the galaxy, that sometimes the smallest flame of courage could light the darkest halls. In the quiet that followed, the girl asked the human what he would do now that the merchant had been broken. He answered simply that he would keep working, as he always had, repairing broken machines, moving cargo, living day by day. But she knew in her heart that nothing would ever be the same again for both of them. He had changed her fate, and she had changed his, for now they walked together, not as prey and protector, but as companions bound by choice, not chains. The station lights flickered above them as they stepped into the wide corridor where voices still echoed of their defiance. The girl lifted her head high for the first time without fear, and the human walked beside her, shoulders straight, his gaze calm. Together they vanished into the flow of the crowd, yet their story remained a living spark, carried on every whisper, reminding all who heard it that no wealth, no jewel, no throne could stand against the courage of a free soul. And so the chase ended, not in chains, not in silence, but in freedom, and in the simple truth that in a galaxy filled with riches and power, what made humans different was not what they owned, but what they were willing to stand for. And that truth burned brighter than any jewel ever could. The end.